You've probably seen the video. A brand new Jollibee opens somewhere in America, and the line wraps around the building, sometimes for blocks, sometimes overnight, sometimes with people in lawn chairs waiting for fried chicken and a plate of sweet spaghetti. It looks like the most obvious business opportunity in fast food. Proven demand, a cult following, a menu people already love before they've even tried it. If you've ever watched one of those opening day videos and thought, I should look into buying one of these, you're not alone. And you'd be wrong about how that actually works, not because Jollibee would turn you down necessarily, but because the franchise you're picturing barely exists. Here's the detail almost nobody mentions when they talk about Jollibee's US growth. The overwhelming majority of Jollibee restaurants in America are not franchises at all. They're owned outright by the company. Of the restaurants Jollibee counted as open for the full year in its most recent US disclosure, only 2 were franchised. 75 were corporate owned. The brand people talk about as a franchise success story has, until very recently, mostly just been Jollibee opening Jollibees with its own money. That's the real starting point for understanding what a Jollibee franchise actually is, and why the door into it looks nothing like the door into a Subway or a Dunkin'. The version most people carry around in their head is the small business version of franchising. Pay a fee, get the recipes and the branding and some training, find a storefront, run it. That model is why a Subway can be opened for a few $100,000, sometimes less. Jollibee's disclosure documents describe something else entirely. Depending on whether the restaurant is a freestanding building or an inline space inside a shopping center, the estimated total investment runs from roughly $1.6 million at the low end to nearly $4.9 million at the high end. A freestanding location alone is estimated between $2.1 million and $4.6 million once you count real estate, construction, kitchen equipment, and signage. That's not fast food franchise money. That's closer to what it costs to open a car dealership. And the price tag is only the first filter. To even be considered for ownership in the US, Jollibee requires a minimum net worth of $10 million and at least $5 million in liquid, immediately available cash. Sit with that second number. $5 million in cash on hand is roughly 2 to 3 times the entire cost of opening the restaurant itself. That's not a background check to weed out people who can't pay their bills. It's a filter that assumes you're not applying to open one restaurant. You're applying to prove you could open several tomorrow without blinking. That assumption turns out to be exactly right, and it reframes everything else. Jollibee isn't really recruiting franchisees in the traditional sense. It's recruiting developers, operators willing to commit to 10 or more restaurants inside a single territory. A recent 15-unit deal signed for the Northern California market shows the actual shape of these agreements. Not here's your one location, but an 8-year build-out plan across an entire region, backed by someone who already knows how to run a multi-unit portfolio. The individual restaurant you saw the line outside of isn't the product being sold. The territory is. So why can Jollibee afford to be this selective when most fast food brands are begging for franchisees? The answer is in the sales numbers, and it's the piece that makes the rest of the math make sense. According to the company's own disclosures, its US restaurants open for a full year average close to $5 million in annual sales, with freestanding locations averaging around $4.9 million and inline locations slightly higher, a figure that's reportedly been climbing by double digits year over year. For comparison, most chicken chains in America, including KFC, Popeyes, and Church's, sit in the $1 to $2 million range per location. Even fast-rising competitors rarely clear $3 million. Jollibee is running at roughly double to quadruple the volume of a typical fried chicken restaurant. A company generating that kind of revenue per store doesn't need to make ownership easy. It can make ownership expensive, and people with the money will still line up, the way customers already do outside the building. This is where the picture most people carry turns out to be backwards. A higher sales number sounds like a straightforwardly better deal. It isn't automatically one. Bigger volume comes with a bigger kitchen. Jollibee's menu spans fried chicken, a sweetened spaghetti sauce, burgers, and pies, which means fryers, sauce stations, and specialized equipment that by some estimates alone runs $250,000 to $500,000 on top of the building itself. And every dollar of that higher revenue gets taxed at the same rate as a smaller store would be, a 5% royalty and a 4% marketing fund contribution, both calculated on gross sales, not profit. On a location doing $5 million a year, That's roughly $250,000 in royalties and $200,000 in marketing fees leaving the business annually, before payroll, before food costs, before a single loan payment. The bigger the number on the sign, the bigger the number Jollibee collects in absolute dollars, even though the percentage never changes. Now add the part almost nobody outside the disclosure paperwork ever reads. Jollibee does not offer its own financing. Whatever multi-million dollar figure a franchisee needs, they're borrowing it, typically through SBA loans, the federally backed financing most independent restaurant buildouts run on at rates that have recently sat around 10 to 13%. On a $2 million loan over 10 years, that alone can mean monthly payments in the range of $26,000 to $28,000 every month, regardless of how the store performs that particular month. Stack that on top of the royalty and marketing fees, then add real estate, labor, and food costs that typically eat another 28 to 35% of revenue in this industry, and you start to see how a location can post an impressive $5 million in annual sales, while the money that actually reaches the owner's pocket is a much thinner slice than the headline number suggests. A healthy top line doesn't automatically mean a healthy bottom line. It just means there's more revenue for every other party in the chain to take a cut from first. The story of George Almeida shows what this actually looks like once someone signs on. Almeida spent roughly 4 decades in fast food, running Fuddruckers locations and, more recently, Dave's Hot Chicken restaurants across Northern California, a brand that had its own moment of explosive, line-around-the-block popularity. He sold his Dave's Hot Chicken franchises in 2024. Then, rather than chasing whatever concept was trending next, he signed a development agreement to bring 15 Jollibee restaurants to the Bay Area over the following 8 years, pointing to the region's large Filipino community as a natural fit for the brand. It's a useful window into who actually clears Jollibee's bar. Not a first-time entrepreneur chasing a viral moment, but someone who had already run one hyped fast food brand through a full cycle, cashed out, and had the balance sheet to immediately reload into the next one. That's also where the risk in this model becomes clearer, because these are multi-unit development deals financed with large loans and, typically in agreements at this scale, backed by personal guarantees. A struggling location isn't necessarily an isolated problem. It sits on the same balance sheet as every other store in the territory, tied to the same debt the operator signed up for. A single restaurant landing below the average, and in Jollibee's own reported data, well under half of locations actually exceed it, doesn't just underperform quietly. It can pull against the financing holding up the entire portfolio the operator committed to building, which is what makes the honest answer to how does this actually go a spread rather than a single number. In the best case, a mature location running near that $5 million average at the roughly 15 to 20% four-wall margins, what's left over from a single restaurant's own sales after its own costs, before any loan payments, typical of high-volume quick service restaurants, can throw off $750,000 to $1 million a year, and multiplied across a 10 or 15 store territory. That's a life-changing portfolio. In the realistic case, several stores in that territory land below average, rising labor costs and debt service compress the margin further, and the operator is running a demanding, capital-intensive business for a return that's healthy, but far from the number implied by the average sales headline. In the failure case, the one no franchise brochure includes, a location or two underperforms badly enough that debt service alone consumes what should have been profit, and because personal guarantees typically sit underneath financing at this size, that failure doesn't stay contained to one restaurant. Which brings the story back to that line outside the new location, the one that made this whole thing look simple in the first place. That line was never lying. The demand is real, and it's a real part of why Jollibee's numbers are unusually strong for the category. But the demand was never the barrier. The barrier was always the several million dollars and the operating track record required to stand behind that line and build a kitchen big enough to serve it. Jollibee spent years opening more than 100 restaurants almost entirely with its own money before it started handing the model to outside operators at scale, proving the volume worked before asking anyone else to bet on it. That sequencing is the whole story. Every number this video has walked through, the AUV, the margins, the growth rate, was generated with Jollibee's own money first, which is exactly why the company can now ask outside operators to match that capital instead of gamble on it. A Jollibee franchise isn't a small business dream you buy your way into. It's a proven, high-volume revenue engine that Jollibee only hands to people who can already prove they know how to run one. And the 8-figure net worth requirement isn't there to keep the business exclusive. It's there because the business already is.